The steady thrum of the ISV Tethra's engines reverberated through the hull, a mechanical heartbeat that marked the crew's entrance into the void of Aylis 7's orbit. The planet loomed beneath them, its swirling atmosphere a murky veil of blue-gray mist that clung to its surface like a dying breath. Commander Elena Voss stood by the reinforced viewport, her reflection blending with the cold abyss outside. The hollow silence of the ship pressed against her ears, more oppressive than the endless stretch of space itself. "Telemetry reads stable orbit, Commander," Engineer Cole announced, though the tightness in his voice betrayed more doubt than relief. The young man's gaze darted between his console and the planet below, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything, that would justify their presence in this forgotten corner of the galaxy. "Good," Elena replied, eyes never leaving the swirling void. The outpost, designated Station Tethra, had once been a pinnacle of advanced xenobiological research. 3 years ago, communication had ceased, the reason chalked up to catastrophic equipment failure. Yet now, a distress call had broken that silence, static-laden and garbled. The transmission had carried a voice, strained and hollow, barely recognizable as human. "It sees everything. Don't look. Too late." The words had gnawed at her mind during the journey, resurfacing in her dreams as whispers that twisted into screams. "Commander, final approach, vector set," Pilot Oren called from the cockpit. His eyes flicked over his controls, fingers tapping a familiar nervous rhythm against the throttle. Elena glanced at the crew. Cole, his jittery movements barely masking the fear beneath. Dr. Priya Nair, the biologist brought on board to decipher whatever alien remnant the team might encounter, her sharp eyes clouded by unspoken worry. Corporal Lang, muscles taut under his combat suit, eyes narrowed and alert. Each face mirrored her own dread, though none spoke it aloud. "Brace for descent," she ordered, gripping the rail as the ship hummed and shifted. The ISV Tethra nosed down into the mists of Aylis 7, swallowed whole by the planet's ghostly shroud. The landing was rougher than anticipated. The ship groaned as its landing struts met the hardened earth, a surface cold and metallic, as though the planet itself rejected their presence. Elena's boots crunched on the gravel as she stepped onto the surface. The air, a blend of stale metallic tang and an earthy rot, coiled around her, sticking to her skin like a shroud. "Atmospheric readings are normal, if not stale," Cole said, a futile attempt to keep his voice steady. The landscape around them was barren, the horizon obscured by jagged rock formations that jutted up like the bones of a forgotten giant. Ahead, the silhouette of the outpost loomed, its steel panels scuffed and dulled under layers of sediment. "Priya, you're up," Elena said, nodding toward the outpost's entrance. The biologist approached, her scanner humming softly as she waved it over the security panel. The machine's response was almost immediate, a sharp, angry buzz that made her flinch. "It's sealed tight, Commander. Emergency lockdown protocols," Priya muttered, stepping back. The sense of abandonment clung to the outpost like a second skin, an echo of whatever calamity had silenced its corridors. Lang stepped forward, the barrel of his pulse rifle at the ready. "Give me the go, and I'll cut us a way in." Elena hesitated for a moment, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on her back, before nodding. "Do it." With a few expert moves, Lang overrode the panel, sparks scattering across his gloved hands. The door groaned, gears grinding in protest as it slid open just enough for them to pass single file. Darkness spilled out, cool and indifferent, as if beckoning them into its depths. The inside was a maze of corridors, sterile and metallic, but marred by something unnatural. The white walls were scratched with dark lines, spiraling symbols that seemed to pulse under the beam of their lights. Elena ran her fingers over one of the spirals, its edges rough and torn, as if carved in a panic. "Commander," Cole's voice shook, drawing their attention down the corridor. His flashlight caught something slumped against the wall, a torn spacesuit, the name tag smeared with blood. The helmet, cracked open, revealed nothing but empty darkness. No bones, no remnants of the occupant. Just hollow silence. A sudden crackle came from the ship's comlink, startling them. The voice that followed was unmistakably human, but each word came in jagged pieces, saturated with static. Don't move. Can't see, but knows. Don't look." The silence that followed was more dreadful than the voice itself. It was as if the outpost itself had drawn in a breath, listening to them with its unseen eyes. Priya took a step back, her eyes wide. "We shouldn't be here." The shadows seemed to shift in agreement, creeping along the walls, closing in like a whisper. The air inside Station Tethra was heavy, stale with the scent of rust and something older, more insidious. It was the smell of abandonment and fear, carried on a silence that seemed to thrum with a life of its own. The crew moved deeper into the complex, their flashlights slicing through the dark like thin, desperate beams of hope. The sound of their footsteps echoed down the metallic corridors, swallowed quickly by an oppressive quiet that pressed against their ears. "Keep a tight formation," Elena ordered, her voice low but firm. It was less a command than a mantra, repeated to stave off the gnawing dread that threatened to unravel her resolve. Ahead of her, Corporal Lang's broad shoulders tensed under the harsh light, his pulse rifle sweeping left and right. The tension in the air was electric, sparking off the metal walls and crackling in the charged silence. Priya Nair stopped abruptly, her flashlight catching something scrawled across the bulkhead. The marks were deep, jagged carvings that spiraled and twisted into shapes that defied reason. She reached out with hesitant fingers, tracing the symbol's uneven edges. A chill prickled down her spine, and she pulled her hand back as if the wall itself had bitten her. "These markings, they're not random," she whispered. "They are deliberate, almost communicative." "Keep moving," Lang snapped, his eyes darting to every shadow that lingered just out of reach. The narrow beam of his light caught something wet on the floor, a thin, iridescent trail that led down the adjacent hallway. It shimmered under the light, like a living scar etched into the steel. The hallway split into a series of smaller corridors, each more labyrinthine and claustrophobic than the last. The crew's movements slowed, their breaths growing shallower as the walls seemed to close in, pressing the weight of silence against their chests. Cole wiped sweat from his brow, the sound loud in the quiet. Each step forward felt like it led deeper into the jaws of something ancient and insatiable. Suddenly, a skittering noise, sharp and erratic, cracked the silence like a whip. The crew froze, eyes wide and unblinking. Elena's heart thudded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. The sound came again, this time accompanied by a metallic scrape, as though something was dragging itself over the station's steel floors. Lang raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. A pale beam of light from Cole's flashlight wavered as he pointed it down the hall, the edges flickering as his hand shook. The beam revealed nothing but empty metal and shadow, but the noise persisted, moving faster now, echoing off the walls until it became a cacophony of clicks and scrapes. "It's behind the walls," Priya said, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes darted to the ceiling where the vents gaped like silent mouths. "It's moving all around us." Elena stepped forward, her own flashlight catching a glint of movement at the far end of the corridor. A glistening membranous object was partially visible before disappearing into the darkness, a brief glimpse that sent a shiver up her spine. It was wet, skeletal, and unnervingly quick. "Contact, rear left!" Lang shouted as the skittering reached a fever pitch. His flashlight caught a blurred shape, a distortion of movement too rapid to be human. He fired, the pulse rifle's blast exploding through the silence. The sound reverberated, followed by a metallic hiss that echoed down the hall, blending with the frantic beating of their hearts. "Stay together," Elena ordered, but the warning came too late. The shadows shifted, and with them came a guttural, resonant groan, as though the station itself had awakened. Lang's light flickered and his eyes widened as something dark and slick darted toward him from above. It dropped without a sound, a mass of sinew and limbs that defied anatomy. It writhed and snapped, moving with an intelligence that mocked their presence. Lang fell back, firing in a wild arc as he screamed. The beam from his flashlight clattered to the floor, illuminating the creature's glossy, eyeless face, a hollow maw split wide in silent hunger. Elena's breath caught as she raised her weapon, aiming for the center of the thing as it scuttled toward them with an unnatural, fluid motion. Priya gasped and stumbled backward, hands scrambling for anything to hold on to. Cole stood frozen, eyes locked on the impossible, mind refusing to reconcile what he was seeing. A second creature joined the first, slipping out from a side corridor like a predator flushed from its lair. The noise rose, a bone-deep chittering that drilled into their minds, pulling at the fabric of reason. "Fall back! To the airlock!" Elena shouted, voice hoarse with panic. The crew began to retreat, steps clumsy and erratic as they tried to maintain their focus on the approaching horrors. The creatures seemed to move with purpose, not just hunting but studying them, testing their resolve. As they reached the junction that led to the docking bay, a sudden shudder rolled through the station, knocking them off their feet. The lights above flickered, and for a heartbeat, the corridor was plunged into total darkness. When the lights snapped back, one of the creatures stood mere inches from Cole, its head tilted as if listening. Time stopped as its faceless head loomed, a breath away from his. And then, with a swift, fluid motion, it dragged him into the dark. His screams cut off sharply, leaving behind only the living silence. The corridors of Station Tethra twisted around them like the intestines of some monstrous creature, slick and pulsing with a life of their own. The low, throbbing sound that had haunted them since their arrival grew louder with each step, an omnipresent reminder that they were trespassers in something else's domain. The temperature plummeted, and each breath hung in the air like a ghost, wisps of desperation curling and dissipating. Elena Voss led the way, pulse rifle held steady, but her grip betraying the tension that coiled in her muscles. Behind her, Priya Nair clung to her scanner like a lifeline, eyes darting to the readings that spiked erratically with every passing second. Corporal Lang was a shadow at their rear, his mouth a thin, hard line as he swung his light across the shadows, ready for any movement. They entered a vast chamber that yawned open like the mouth of a beast. The walls were not the familiar sterile white of the rest of the outpost, but a sickly organic black, veined with web-like patterns that glistened as though wet. Elena's flashlight swept across the room, landing on rows of dark, fleshy pods that lined the floor and walls, each one pulsing gently in time with the low hum that now vibrated in their very bones. "God," Priya whispered, eyes wide and glistening with a mix of wonder and horror. She stepped closer to one of the pods, its translucent surface barely containing the thing inside. "They're alive! Get back!" Lang's warning was sharp, but it was too late. The chamber reacted to their presence. The pulsing intensified, and a series of soft, wet pops resonated from the pods. The first burst, open with a spray of viscous fluid, a grotesque mockery of birth. A long, sinewy appendage unfurled, tapping at the air like a blind snake, before recoiling and pulling the rest of the creature from its organic prison. It was eyeless, like the creature they had encountered in the corridor, but larger, more angular, and covered in a pattern of dark ridges that glistened under the thin beams of their flashlights. It moved with an unsettling grace, head tilting as though listening, sensing the collective thundering of their hearts. Before Elena could bark an order, the pod beside it shivered and split, and then another and another, until the room was alive with the sound of wet, tearing flesh and the clicking, probing movements of the newly born creatures. The walls seemed to vibrate in sympathy, the black veins lighting up in pulses that ran the length of the chamber and disappeared into the shadowed ceiling. "Back to the corridor, now!" Elena yelled, the command breaking the spell of frozen terror that had gripped them. Lang stepped forward, pulse rifle spitting controlled bursts of blue energy. The creatures recoiled, shrieking as they scattered across the chamber, but for every one he repelled, two more emerged, limbs unfurling with horrific precision. "Commander!" Priya's voice was high and cracked as her flashlight swept over the far wall. There, etched into the living surface, were more of the twisted spiral symbols, but these were accompanied by thousands of small, unblinking eyes. They blinked in perfect unison, following the crew's every movement with a malevolent sentience that transcended comprehension. Each eye was black, glossy, reflecting their terror back at them. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The hive of eyes, as Priya had started to whisper, was not just a nest. It was watching them, learning them, absorbing their fear. Her mind reeled, a surge of memories flashing back to her training, warnings of ancient horrors that defied logic, but nothing had prepared her for this. Lang's rifle sputtered, a telltale sign of an overheating core. He dropped it, drawing his sidearm, but the creatures were relentless. One leapt forward, its limb cracking like a whip as it knocked him off balance, the gun skidding across the slick floor. He rolled, gasping as another creature loomed over him, its head splitting open into a mass of twitching, segmented feelers. A pulse of light raced along the walls, and the eyes flickered with what almost seemed like anticipation. The shrieking noise intensified, harmonizing with the low hum that had accompanied them since they arrived. The creatures paused for a moment as if awaiting a signal. Elena took the opportunity, grabbing Priya by the arm and yanking her toward the exit. "Move, move!" They ran, the echo of Lang's shout cutting through the noise as he struggled behind them. One creature latched onto his leg, dragging him toward the center of the chamber. The last thing Elena saw before they turned the corner was the wave of creatures descending upon him, Silent now, eyes fixed and unyielding. Priya sobbed, stumbling as she followed Elena through the maze of corridors. The walls seemed closer now, trembling in response to the chaos they left behind. The eyes, they could feel them still, watching through every vent, every seam in the metal, following their progress. "We can't go back to the Tethra," Priya said, breathless, tears streaking her face. "It's too late. We're not safe anywhere." Elena's jaw clenched as she processed the grim reality. The Hive wasn't just contained within the outpost, it was the outpost, and they were already ensnared within its gaze. Somewhere deeper in the station, the eyes blinked again, their collective movement a silent promise of what was to come. The narrow corridor reverberated with the sound of Elena's breath, ragged and sharp as she pushed herself forward. Her pulse drummed against her temples, a relentless metronome that kept time with Priya's stumbling footfalls behind her. The station groaned around them, a low, insidious sound that spoke of something vast and ancient, shifting in its depths. "We have to keep moving," Elena gasped, sparing a glance over her shoulder. Priya's eyes were wide and unfocused, her face slick with sweat and streaked with grime. Every inch of her screamed exhaustion, but they both knew stopping was not an option. Ahead, the corridor opened into what had once been the command center of Station Tethra. The room was a wreck of shattered consoles and sparking wires, the air thick with the acrid stench of scorched metal. But it was the silence that stole Elena's breath, the deceptive, waiting silence that seemed to gather in every corner like a predator. Priya stumbled into the room, her scanner still in her trembling hands. It blinked red, an angry pulse that offered no answers, only the dread certainty that they were surrounded. She sank to her knees, eyes darting as if searching for a reason in the madness. We can't fight this," she whispered, each word cracking like dry leaves. "It's part of this place. It's in everything." Elena's eyes flicked to the console at the center of the room, its controls smeared with blood. It was the containment protocol, Omega, the station's last resort. She knew activating it meant sealing them in, detonating the core to ensure that whatever lived within these walls could never leave. It was a death sentence, a choice that felt both necessary and impossible. The low hum intensified, a vibration that resonated through the walls and deep into their bones. The veins that crisscrossed the surfaces glistened, pulsing with a life that defied reason. Elena took a hesitant step forward, fingers outstretched toward the console when the silence shattered. The air erupted in a chorus of shrill, clicking cries. Dark shapes coalesced at the edges of the room, limbs unfurling in a grotesque dance as the creatures advanced. Their bodies were slick, their movements disturbingly synchronized, and in the center of their eyeless faces, the skin split to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. Priya screamed, a sound so raw that it cut through Elena's resolve. Elena turned, the room shrinking around her as she met Priya's gaze. "Get behind me," she shouted, pulse rifle aimed at the nearest shape. The beam of blue light carved through the dark, the creature's body jerking back with a spasm before it fell silent. But more came, relentless and hungry, eyes blinking open along the walls, their dark surfaces reflecting the light in mocking glimmers. "We're out of time," Priya shouted, backing up until her body collided with the command console. Her eyes darted to the sequence displayed on the cracked screen, a series of keystrokes that would set the protocol in motion. Elena nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. They both knew what had to happen. The station quaked and the pulsing veins flared with light as more creatures poured from the shadows. They were hemmed in, their weapons little more than temporary reprieves against an inevitable fate. "Do it," Elena said, voice steady despite the chaos roaring around them. Priya's hand shook as she reached for the console, fingers hovering over the final key. She hesitated, eyes meeting Elena's one last time, searching for reassurance. Elena gave a nod, and in that moment she felt something akin to peace, a fragile surrender to the only choice left. Priya pressed the button. The change was immediate. The low hum turned into a deafening roar, a mechanical scream as the station's core activated its failsafe. The walls trembled, cracks splitting open to reveal the glowing, shifting mass behind them. Thousands of eyes blinking in frantic synchrony. The creatures halted, their bodies frozen as the station itself shuddered and heaved. Elena reached for Priya, pulling her close as the heat surged, filling the room with blinding light. The creatures screamed, their cries mingling with the sound of metal twisting and the deep, consuming roar of the blast. For a split second, Elena could see them clearly, each grotesque detail, the writhing limbs, the eyeless faces split in a final silent wail. Then came the silence, not the living, breathing silence that had hunted them through the halls, but the final, infinite silence of oblivion. The station erupted, a blinding sphere of light consuming itself in an instant, leaving nothing behind but the cold, indifferent darkness of space. The ISV Tethra drifted in orbit, abandoned, a ghost ship reflecting the faint light of Aylis 7. The last signals sent from its command center blinked on a lone monitor, a desperate transmission lost in the vastness of space. It sees everything. Don't look. Too late. Somewhere deep in the wreckage of the outpost, buried under layers of rock and molten metal, the last of the blinking eyes dimmed, but not before catching a glimmer of something that might have been satisfaction.